Hello, everyone. Welcome to Queer Lawyers Speak, hosted by LAGBAC, Chicago's LGBTQ plus Bar Association. My name is Adam Zebelian, and I'm the current president of LAGBAC, Chicago's LGBTQ plus Bar Association. Today, our guest is Howard Suskin. Welcome, Howard.
Thanks, Adam.
Howard is an individual that, if you look at his resume, is very intimidating. He has many prestigious degrees. He's had a prominent law career as a partner at Jenner & Block, which is one of the largest law firms in the country. However, if you meet Howard, you know that he has a heart of gold, and he has done a tremendous amount of work for our community, so it's very special that he is with us today.
Thanks, Adam. I need to hire you as my PR agent.
There was much more I could say, but Howard, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. I have been a partner at the law firm Jenner & Block, as Adam mentioned, for it's now 42 years. I co-chair our securities litigation practice, and I'm also the co-chair emeritus of our firm's LGBTQ Affinity Forum.
Well, thank you, Howard. All right, Howard, the topic of today's show is history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Now, I stole that from you as a theme that you brought up to me. What does that mean, and what does it mean in the context of being an LGBTQ plus lawyer or individual?
Well, I actually borrowed that phrase from Mark Twain. I did not invent it.
Okay, so, clearly I don't know that.
But it's a phrase that has been mentioned quite a bit recently. As you know, we are in difficult times for the LGBTQ community. I think other than our friends in the immigrant community, I don't think there is any other group or demographic that's currently being attacked as much as the LGBTQ community, particularly our brothers and sisters in the transgender community. And as anxious and concerned and worried as members of our community are, we have to remind ourselves that we've been through this before, that this is not the first of challenging times that our community has faced, and we've overcome those prior challenges, and I'm hopeful and confident that we'll overcome those again. But I think in order to understand where we are now, it's helpful to have a historical context to where we've been before and to the challenges our community has had previously. So maybe we could talk about that for a few minutes.
Let's dive into that, because I think we were talking before we started today that there is a lot of fear and hurt within our community based on what's been transpiring, especially over the last year. But it's been happening for quite a while now, actually, kind of a reversal of the steps we've made over the past decade or so. And a lot of the young people are kind of shocked by this because they don't really know the history. You've lived it. Tell us what you've seen change throughout your career and what real monumental strides we have taken as a community throughout your career.
Well, let's go back maybe a little bit before the start of my career, just to give a little bit of context. We're actually this year marking the 56th anniversary of Stonewall. And Stonewall, as many of us know, was really the first instance of fighting back against the attacks that were occurring against the LGBTQ community back then. Back then, the concept, for example, of like gay bars didn't really exist in the same way that they exist now. There were bars, there were gatherings of places for people in the community, but they were routinely subject to police raids where people were arrested and outed and in many instances had their careers completely destroyed. If you had a public school teacher who was flashed on the front page of the local newspaper as having been arrested in a raid on one of the gay bars, that was absolutely devastating to their career and to them personally. Stonewall was, in 1969, really the first instance where the community fought back. There was a raid on the Stonewall bar in the Village, in West Village in New York, and instead of allowing themselves to be subjected to that kind of attack, the patrons fought back. And it led to several days of rioting in the streets, and it really ignited something in the community where members were basically saying, we're not going to take this anymore. 1 year later marked the first Gay Pride Parade in Chicago as an outgrowth of that. And back then—
Was Chicago the first Pride Parade in the country?
I think it was simultaneous with some others around the
Larger
country.
city Pride Parades.
But they were very small. I mean, maybe a couple hundred people marching from Washington Square Park in the Gold Coast to the Civic Center, before it was called the Daily Center back then. Now we know that over 1 million people attend the parade, but we've come a long way from that. Around that time, also an outgrowth of the activism in 1973, Lambda Legal, which is really the preeminent legal organization for LGBTQ rights, was formed in New York. And they began suing for housing discrimination and employment discrimination, and they began having victories for our community. And things began to look throughout the 70s like we're making real progress here. And then we had another entry into a really dark period. In 1981, the first reported case of AIDS was noted in the New York Times. And by 1985, over 5,000 people were dead from AIDS. And despite that, all the way through 1985, President Reagan still had not said a word about AIDS. Our community was getting devastated, and no one was paying attention. And so in 1987, an organization called ACT UP was formed by Larry Kramer, who's a very famous playwright in our community. And people began, once again, fighting back, protesting in the streets, having die-ins where people would lay down in the street, block traffic, block public buildings, and insist that attention be paid to the community.
And a die-in would be hundreds of people blocking a street, laying
Yes.
down on the street as if they were dead.
Exactly.
And you were saying that when they were being arrested, the police were in full
Protective gear.
protective gear. They had gloves, masks
gloves.
on because they were fearful of touching the people that were protesting.
Exactly, exactly. And ACT UP wound up being successful with the political activism. It really, and sort of when we talk about history rhyming itself, one of the key players at the time was Anthony Fauci, who we all know in the COVID era as being a hero in terms of managing us through it.
I view him as a hero. You view him as a hero. There are many people that don't, but unfortunately.
And interestingly, back then, in the 1980s, he was the head of one of the national health organizations. He was viewed by Larry Kramer and ACT UP as the villain, because ACT UP was protesting the fact that the National Health Institute, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, were not approving experimental drugs to be released to people who were dying of AIDS, who had no other recourse or remedy. Ultimately, Anthony Fauci came around and became a hero because he then pushed for the authorization for these experimental drugs. The experimental drugs got to people who needed them, and the AIDS crisis began becoming alleviated. People were actually getting health care and getting solutions.
And it was no longer a death sentence in the sense that it was prior to the release of these drugs.
Exactly, but without that political activism and the fighting back in that very dark time, we may not have accomplished getting those to market and getting those to the people who needed it.
Because Fauci fast-tracked those drugs, or at least fought to fast-track those drugs.
He did, and I think he's really, ultimately viewed as one of the heroes who helped our community back then. So once we passed, the worst of the AIDS crisis in the late 1990s and throughout the 2000s, things actually got better for our community. I mean, we made progress. I mean, 2003, Lawrence versus Texas, Supreme Court struck down the sodomy laws. Here in Illinois in 2011, the Illinois legislature recognized civil unions. And in 2014, the Illinois legislature legalized gay marriage in Illinois. Again, because of what our community was advocating, the protests, the lobbying that occurred. And then ultimately in 2015, the Obergefell decision by the Supreme Court legalized marriage nationwide for our community. And so we have been through difficult periods, challenging periods where our community was being attacked, and we prevailed. And then, as you say correctly, the pendulum is now swinging back again. We have state legislatures who are trying to overturn marriage equality. There's discussion that there actually is a case right now seeking review by the Supreme Court to overturn marriage equality. I think the consensus is that it likely is not going to prevail at the Supreme Court and be recognized and taken up. But
Interestingly, though, the plaintiff in that case has been married 3 times.
is it really? Well,
I think it's 3 times she's been married.
it's the clerk, I believe in Kentucky or
Yes,
Tennessee.
she denied the marriage certificates, right?
Exactly, who's now seeking to get the court to overturn.
Overturned, because I think the people she denied sued her for intentional infliction of emotional distress. They prevailed, and I think she's taking that up to the Supreme Court.
I think that's right. So, we are in, I think very perilous times. We've seen all of the legislation that's been directed toward the transgender community, trying to deprive members of the community from gender-affirming health care that they need.
And so much misinformation is out there about what that even means.
Yes. I mean, it's just very difficult. And again, I think our community needs to realize we need to fight back. We need to organize, both politically on the one hand, but also through, great organizations like Lambda Legal and the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, and Equality Illinois here in, our state. That's the only way we're going to be able to push back, against this. And so when you ask, what I've seen over the course of my career, I became a, junior lawyer in the early 80s at the time of the AIDS crisis, at the time that our community was going through very, very difficult times. I've seen how we've made tremendous progress, and now I'm seeing how that progress is being attacked and how we need to, again, step up as a community, both politically and legally, to fight back and preserve what we've gained.
The cycle of history. It's not repeating, but it's rhyming.
But it rhymes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Is there anything that gives you hope based on what's occurring now and being a high-ranking member of your firm and seeing the younger associates come in who, I think, at least in Chicago, and I know the atmosphere in your firm is very welcoming, the younger people do feel, again, here in Chicago, comfortable being more who they are. Do you have hope for the future that this is going to then the pendulum will swing back and we'll get through this, and why?
Well, I think when you just even look at public opinion polls, I mean, acceptance of gay marriage today is way beyond what it was back in the 1980s, for example. And, in terms of, is there a broad public consensus that there should not be employment discrimination against members of the LGBT community? I think you look at the polls, it's very, very high, even among people who take relatively conservative views on other issues as well. There are members of the LGBTQ community that are prominent in business, in government. I mean, even the current administration has a very high-ranking official who's openly gay. And
you and I probably wouldn't hang out with them, but
well, I mean, but the fact is, I mean, there is that acceptance,
right?
In a way that
it
30 years ago,
signals to something else that there is a broader acceptance.
Exactly. So I do have hope because of that, and I have hope that the courts will continue to uphold, the rights in our community. But it's going to require, consistent lobbying, political activism and support for these legal organizations that are really looking out for us in important ways.
Now, you're talking about the legal battles in the courts and how important really the courts are to getting us through this next phase of just blatant discrimination. You are the general counsel of the Chicago Bar Association, which you volunteer your time to do, and you've also sat on the Judicial Evaluations Committee. Now, the Judicial Evaluations Committee in any bar association evaluates candidates for judge and gives a really yay or nay on the candidates. How important are the courts going to be in this next phase of advocacy based on what we're seeing?
I think, the courts really are current, at least currently, they're our last line of defense, because we see, at the federal level currently, given where the relative power is between the political parties, our allies have relatively little power right now at the legislative level because they don't have the votes. And so there is, I think, great dependency right now on the judges following precedent, following the law, and upholding, basic civil rights in our community. So I think, judicial screenings are very important. And, to the extent that organizations like the CBA and LAGBAC and others can do their best to inform voters about what the track records are of candidates for judge, extremely important, because the word has to get out. If there's somebody who has been publicly against our community or against upholding civil rights for our community, they can get nominated, but it's really up to our community to get the word out that this is somebody who may not, view giving us due process and equal protection as priorities in the way that we believe that, all judges should for all communities.
So I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer. There probably isn't. But personally, do you think lawyers, based on our unique position in society, have an ethical obligation to fight for what's right, at least to fight for our community? As LGBTQ lawyers, do we have an obligation to help out our community and donate our services to do that?
I think there may be several parts to that question. I mean, on the one hand, I think all lawyers have an obligation, I think that's a sworn obligation as part of our oath, to uphold the administration of justice. And it's extremely important that all lawyers be committed to the rule of law, which, I think we're seeing currently, maybe not all lawyers are. And that has to be preserved and supported. Rule of law, administration of justice. That applies to everybody, to every community, to every litigant, to every person who's appearing before a court. I think lawyers within our community have a particular obligation to make sure that our community is getting the protection of due process, getting the protection of equal protection under the law, that all people are entitled to, deserve, but not all people get. And so I do think, particularly for lawyers in our community, we need to be supportive of those organizations that are looking out for us, and ourselves take on pro bono work, take on opportunities to make sure that members of our community, particularly those who are maybe have the least opportunity to express their voice, least opportunity to protect themselves, in fact get that protection that they deserve.
So I think you'd agree with me. There is some ethical obligation for us who hold law degrees to step in and help where we can.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's so important people join bar associations, because I think that creates opportunity there to get involved. So you mentioned Obergefell, which is the United States Supreme Court opinion that nationalized same-sex marriage. There has been a lot of fear, genuine fear and valid fear, that case may be overturned. We were just talking about the fact that county clerk has brought a challenge to that in the Supreme Court, and that's going to be decided, I believe, this fall. Do you believe Obergefell is at risk? And my second question would be, is there anything people can do to prepare in the event Obergefell does get overturned?
I think the concern about Obergefell is that in the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, which overturned Roe versus Wade, the abortion case, a number of the justices in their comments suggested that the right of privacy that supported Roe versus Wade, which was ultimately rejected in the reversal in Dobbs, was the same underpinning for support for gay marriage in the Obergefell decision. And the worry is that if that particular underpinning is taken away, that maybe the same rationale would be used to overturn marriage equality. The fact of the matter is there are other grounds to support marriage equality, including equal protection, that individuals within our community should get the same protection and recognition accorded to heterosexual marriages. And so
equal protection under the law, which is afforded to everyone by the Constitution.
Exactly. So look, there's a risk, and certainly there are state legislatures that have been introducing laws in their individual states to overturn it, to not, to ask the court to take up a case and to overrule. There is a risk. But I think the Supreme Court has always been somewhat mindful of the public opinion generally, and I think overturning marriage equality would cause such an enormous backlash that I just don't think the court, at least the majority of the court, would be willing to do that. In a worst case scenario, the reality is we're very fortunate that we're in Illinois, which is a real safe harbor for many of constitutional rights, whether it's abortion rights, whether it's LGBTQ rights, whether it's immigrant rights. We are a safe haven, and so I think no matter what, even if the decision were ultimately left back to the states again, as it were pre-Obergefell, we in Illinois are probably okay. But again, for it to be overturned and affect people in states that don't have the same sort of safe havens would be a real tragedy. And I think we need to continue to advocate and lobby as best we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Someone told me that they think that because there is some risk that Obergefell would be overturned, that people that are considering getting married should get married. I guess there's not much you can do if the Supreme Court opinion is overturned, but I guess that would be one way of at least creating some sort of standing if it was overturned.
That could well be. Who knows whether a court would actually retroactively say that all marriages are void. I think the more likely worst case scenario would be the court would say it's up to each individual state. And so people who are married or in the future get married, their marriages would be recognized by those states that recognize marriage. But even for somebody who is already married, if they go to a state that doesn't recognize marriage anymore, that unfortunately might be a really worst case scenario that could occur.
We're getting much more siloed these days by these sorts of opinions because in Illinois we're becoming more progressive to compensate for the rest of the country or other parts of the country becoming less progressive, and we're just becoming more separate. It's not good.
It's not good, and particularly when it comes to basic constitutional rights, one would expect and hope that there would be uniform recognition across the country, that you wouldn't have to flee to a safe blue state like Illinois in order to be protected. It ought to be every state accords the same respect.
I have kind of a random question for you.
Okay.
Through your 4 years of practice,
42.
or 42 years.
42
years. I was going to say 4 decades. 42 years of practice. Have you ever seen this country so divided? Not just on LGBTQ plus issues, but on all issues.
I don't think so. I don't think we've ever been so divided, and we can come up with any number of theories why that is. I think back even in the 80s when it was first starting, everybody watched the same TV shows. There were only a handful of channels, and everybody sort of had a common experience. And now everyone is siloed between different media, internet sites, and it's really disconcerting in some ways. We don't really have as much of the shared American community as we did, I think, previously.
It is disturbing. I recently got on Instagram, not a couple years ago, but I'm a little bit behind the curve, right? And there's all this stuff that pops up that I say to myself, that can't be real. And then I look into it a little bit, and it certainly is not. The scary part is that's happening more and more, and if you don't vet it, or at least it doesn't click in your head, that can't be real, you assume that it is. And so it's not only that we're hearing different things, we're hearing things that are just flagrantly untrue.
Well, that's a real risk. With AI-generated images particularly, there was actually, coincidentally, today in the New York Times, an op-ed by Senator Klobuchar, who had her voice basically superimposed on an ad that was not her voice in reality. And no one would likely realize it, but what she was saying was absolutely contrary to what she believed. And we're seeing images of, and there was an AI image, I think, of Joe Biden being led away in handcuffs from the Oval Office that AI created. So there is a real risk that what we see can't necessarily be believed anymore.
That's scary. Howard, you're a true intellectual, you're a true champion and advocate, and thank you so much for being here. We got to have you come back because I know I could listen to you speak for hours, and I'm sure the audience would agree. So thank you so much, Howard.
Thank you, Adam. You are the best PR agent anybody could ever hope for.
When this divorce thing gets old, I'm going to try that. So thank you so much, Howard, and thank you to all of you for joining. We'll see you next time.